Talks between the EU and UK over looming electric car tariffs are critical, a trade expert has said after an EU commissioner said changes can't be made to the Brexit trade deal. The European Union has snubbed calls for the Brexit trade deal to be altered over warnings that looming tariffs on electric vehicles will put jobs and exports at risk. Under the deal, 10% tariffs on electric car exports are due to come into force in January, although EU leaders are under mounting pressure to suspend the duty. Thierry Breton, European Commissioner for the Internal Market, has insisted that the deal cannot be altered. His reluctance to budge comes after Stellantis, the parent company for 14 automotive brands including Vauxhall and Jeep and the world number 3 carmaker by sales, warned if the tariffs weren't lifted temporarily, then it would have to close operations in the UK, with thousands of job losses. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association, ACEA, which represents 14 major car, truck, van and bus makers, has also warned billions of euros in exports to Britain would be risked if the deal isn't reconsidered. Despite the warnings, Mr. Breton argued the car industry is not only made up of big brands and it is his job to make sure there is a level playing field. He said the automotive industry is made up of hundreds of thousands of companies which provide everything needed for a car. But MP Andrew Bridgen told Express.co.uk the EU was simply being stubborn and causing itself unnecessary harm just to put Britain in its place. He said, "Anything can be renegotiated if there is the will to do so. Our Brexit agreement should not be set in stone but modified to accommodate new technologies and new products." It appears that some in the EU want to play hardball to punish the UK for leaving even if this damages the EU in the process. Meanwhile, Brexiteer businessman and former MEP Ben Habib argued the German car industry was already playing catch-up in terms of converting its motor industry from internal combustion engines and the EU was therefore shooting itself in the foot with its refusal to budge. He said, "Unlike democratically elected governments, the EU does not bend its political ideology for the interests of the peoples of Europe." Political aims rule supreme. Economic and social outcomes, not so much. When faced with the practical problem of either cutting tariffs on electric vehicle components or facing the loss of production from Europe, they opt for the latter. German car manufacturers are already losing the race to convert their motor industry from internal combustion engines. That loss will be made certain if the EU does not roll back tariffs on components made in the UK but used in Germany. The added cost of producing the vehicles would render them uncompetitive compared to China. So, in its relentless aim to punish the UK, the EU will undermine Germany's ability to succeed, reduce the supply of electrical vehicles by some 480,000 over a 3-year period. So much for their commitment to net zero, and hand the market over to totalitarian China. The greater good is but not compared to political project. Marco Forgione, Director General of the Institute of Export International Trade, also called for a rethink. He told Express.co.uk, the UK and the EU's automotive industries enjoy a strong and mutually dependent relationship. It's also a hugely important sector to economies across the continent, not least one which employs thousands of people throughout the supply chain. So it is critical that dialogue remains open and constructive in order to find solutions that work for both parties. In order to qualify for tariff preferences, goods exported under EU free trade agreements must comply with rules of origin. The current transitional rules in the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA, allow batteries assembled in Europe to qualify for European origin. These rules will become much more restrictive from January 1, requiring all battery parts as well as some critical battery material to be produced in either the EU or UK to qualify for tariff-free trade. As many electric vehicle batteries are imported from China, the tariffs are expected to hit carmakers in Britain and the EU. They could also lead to higher EV prices for consumers and therefore hinder efforts to cut carbon emissions. Britain wants to postpone the tariffs until 2027. The ASEA has called for a 3-year postponement, warning tariffs could total £3. €7 billion, €4.3 billion, and potentially reduce EV production by 480,000 units. Recent reports suggest Germany is in favor of waiving the tariffs, but the French government's position is believed to be unclear. Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, SMMT, Chief Executive Mike Hawes said the need to resolve the issue is now urgent. Mr. Hawes told Express.co.uk, upcoming rules of origin for batteries pose a significant challenge to manufacturers on both sides of the channel, with the prospect of tariffs and price increases on electrified vehicles that would discourage consumers from buying the very models needed to achieve shared climate change goals. With now just over 100 days until this situation arises, we look to the EU and UK to agree urgently a pragmatic solution to delay the introduction of overdemanding origin requirements for batteries, something which is perfectly possible within the existing UK-EU TCA, Trade and Cooperation Agreement, framework. The renewed pleas for the EU to back down come after Mr. Breton told The Guardian, "If something has been negotiated, it shouldn't be changed." He argued that the European Commission and EU leaders are bound by competition laws to consider the whole automotive ecosystem and not favor one category of the industry over another. He added, "It is a global supply chain. I call it the ecosystem, and I have to look at, as Commissioner of Industry, not at one single part of this ecosystem but all of the ecosystem." He added each sector had to be treated fairly because they have the same rights under competition law.